Welcome to the latest Labour CND podcast, everyone. Thanks for joining us. If this is your first time at a Labour CND podcast and you'd like what you hear, then please do give us a like, give us a follow, and there are details of how to do that at the end of this session. Today, I'm discussing the NATO summit in Ankara with our guest. She's Kate Hudson, who is well known amongst peace and anti-war movements in Europe. She was the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament until she stepped down at the end of 2024. So thanks for joining us, Kate. I know that you're still a NATO watcher and still active in the peace and anti-war movements. Before we get stuck into the NATO summit, tell us a bit about yourself, what you're doing nowadays.
Thanks, Carol. Well, I'm definitely still active in the movements, as you've said. Help out any way I can, mostly with C&D and Stop the War Coalition. But before I went to work for C&D, I was an academic and I was mostly writing and teaching about history and politics, mostly 20th century, really fascinating stuff. So in a small way, I've gone back to being a historian, but somehow combining it with my experience in the movement. So what I'm doing at the moment is writing a biography of Pat Arrowsmith. And some people may remember Pat. She was the most amazing woman. She was one of the first people in Britain to undertake non-violent direct action in the cause of peace and, of course, nuclear disarmament. She was active from the late 50s into the 1990s and beyond. Incredibly, Carol, she served 11 prison sentences, and that included escaping from prison on one occasion, going on the run on another occasion, and also going on hunger strike. What a woman.
Absolutely. She reminds me of Helen John, whom you and I both knew well as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's turn to this year's NATO summit. It seems to me that the 2026 NATO summit focused on European rearmament and pushing up military spending. President Trump, Mark Rutte, the NATO General Secretary, and the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen all called for European members and Canada too to increase the rate at which the military spending was rising so that they would meet NATO's target, which is 5% of GDP by the end of 2035. What was your take on the summit, Kate?
Well, I found it very interesting. If I could just add something in before I answer your questions, particularly. I don't know if people know, but there was a counter summit planned by the movement in Turkey and across Europe and more widely, both in Ankara and in Istanbul. The one in Ankara was banned. The one in Istanbul went ahead, but a lot of the activists from Western Europe who tried to get there were actually prevented from joining it. So the director of the International Peace Bureau, for example, who will be known to some of us, Sean Connor, he was actually stopped at the airport, detained, interrogated, and deported the following morning. So we are facing very new territory here. So people have been watching very closely what the outcomes were going to be. Um, I suppose things that struck me, just on the kind of technical front, the final statement was very brief. Often they're pages long, but this was pretty much all on one side, and it just reaffirmed a number of commitments. So it reaffirmed commitment to NATO's Article 5, which is collective defense. Defense of one is defense of all, so to speak. The 5% military spending that was agreed last year, Europe and Canada assuming greater responsibility for European defense, support for Ukraine, and also that Iran should never have a nuclear weapon. Now, to me, there's nothing new in that. That's all pretty much been said last year or at some previous occasion. So it struck me that really what they were trying to do was demonstrate to the US how well they were complying with US demands. So um, Other things, there was no announcement of the date and location of next year's summit, so that's pretty unusual. Normally, we know by now where it's gonna be, which is nice because it gives us an opportunity to start planning the process, but anyway, we don't know. Um, Mainly, it struck me how the US basically has everything it wants out of this. This is absolutely clear. So Europe is going to pay for its own defense, and that frees the US up to focus on what it wants to focus on, which is its actions in the Indo-Pacific. So it's like US has pulled out, other people step up to pay and do all that kind of stuff, but the US still remains top dog and is still calling the shots, so it seems a little bit unequal, to put it mildly. So outcomes, therefore, in practical terms, we're heading for even more military spending, even though the total European NATO spending is already more than Russia's. So why do we need to spend more? And of course, Britain has now overtaken Russia as the world's third largest nuclear spender. So, you know, anyway, just seems beyond crazy to me. Just to finally say, a buzzword around the summit, people may have picked it up, is this thing NATO 3.0. In other words, kind of NATO Mark 3. So I thought, what on earth is that? NATO Mark 1 was during the Cold War, where Europe spent vast amounts on the military. NATO Mark 2 was post Cold War, with disarmament, reduced military spending in Europe. And 3 is basically a return to the Cold War model where Europe spends big in its own defense. So that's what that's about. And as far as I can see, a big element of that is US desire for Europe to buy American military kit, to integrate US and European military infrastructures and basically have lots of huge, lucrative military contracts. So that's all kind of wrapped up in there, I think.
That's a very comprehensive reply, Kate.
Oh, thanks.
Um, I don't feel I need to prod you to say a bit more about the sort of overall NATO outcomes, but I would like to engage in a bit of a discussion about nuclear spending. I mean, NATO's combined military spending in 2005, if I've got my figures right, was $559 billion. That's over $500 billion. You know me, I often get my noughts wrong, but I think I've got that right. Um, and sorry, that was, did I say America? I meant to say European NATO spending. And when you add to that Canada, which is another 37 odd $1 billion, that actually shows the sort of the amount of money that the global north is throwing into a wardrobe. But I want to focus a little bit, if I might, on nuclear spending. You will be as aware as I am of the ICAN, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons report, which was issued a few weeks before the summit, which pointed out the degree to which the spending, the nuclear spending by the 9 nuclear armed states was sort of going up absolutely dramatically. Uh, in my opinion, leading towards a new arms race. Um, and what that was in 2025, apart from the UK overtaking Russia as the third largest military spending, which I, like you, I thought that was the most shocking statistic that came out of the ICANN report. But apart from that, we got the following. We got the fact that America outspends the other 8 nuclear powers by more than 50%. Um, more than 50% of the entire spending. Um, it overtakes China, the second biggest military spending, by a considerable amount as well. And we also got what is a figure I don't think I'd ever seen this around. It's very difficult to get from British defence statistics, but we got the information that the UK military budget, about 14% of that is accounted for by nuclear weapons. And what we know, not only in the case of Britain, but everywhere, is that nuclear projects are long term, and therefore we can expect that the spending will continue to rise over the next 5, 10 years, or even longer. What did you pick up about nuclear spending in particular? What have you picked up about that in the recent period, Kate?
So first of all, I would recommend if people have got time, just to look at that ICANN report. It's got so many facts and figures. It's really accessibly written. So if you're interested in more depth, really do go and look at that. I suppose what struck me is firstly the extent to which British spending has increased. So when I first started getting involved in C&D or became chair and GenSec and all that sort of thing, it was a fairly stable level of spending. It used to be around, I think, sort of 7 or 8% of the defence budget went on nuclear, and it was usually about, I can't remember exactly, but like 4 or 5 billion. I mean, it was that order of thing, that order of proportion. And it's kind of pretty much exponentially grown. And over the last few years, it seems to me that pretty much every chancellor has kind of quite significantly upped the spending on it. So I think it was stated recently that 64 billion, Britain was going to spend 64 billion on nuclear weapons over the next 4 years. Right. So this is a very significant increase. But what's also striking is when you hear reports from even government agencies and scrutiny bodies about what's being done with the spending, what's being done with all that money, what is our nuclear kit like, what's happening with replacements of things, it's pretty much chaos with very little progress and just a massively escalating budget. Now, don't get me wrong, Carol, I'm not saying they should have got this sub out years ago. Why haven't we got all these fantastic new subs out already? Well, obviously, I don't want them out to come out at all, but it's this kind of mismatch between sort of grandiose ideas and, Britain on the world stage with all its nuclear stuff. And then when you compare it with actually what are we doing? What have we produced? It's just a kind of just bad, bad situation, in their own terms, it's a really bad situation. So we're not performing. So it makes it kind of doubly terrible that all this money is being chucked at it. It seems the more money they chuck at it, doesn't make any difference in terms of competence. And I think that's why you do often get military people, often retired military people saying, just scrap the nuclear thing, let's spend it on boots or, housing for veterans, because the nuclear thing is just a complete sinkhole for Britain's resources and taxpayers' money and all that kind of thing. So it's just like a just complete waste. Never mind the fact that having nuclear weapons makes us a target and all that kind of thing, and encourages proliferation elsewhere. It's just it's just terrible and incompetent and a disaster zone. So that's one thing that strikes me. It was agreed decades ago to have a replacement of the Trident nuclear weapon system. Have we actually seen anything out of that? No, we haven't, even though that the cost has exponentially increased. And then I suppose the other thing is that we are spending kind of escalating amounts of money, but that's a tiny drop in the ocean compared to what the United States spends. So it, it's just incomprehensible that what is essentially public money, taxpayers here, taxpayers in the United States, everywhere else that has nuclear weapons, it's just being squandered on making weapons of mass destruction.
Absolutely. I want to return to that theme before we finish the podcast, if I may. But let's, for a moment at least, let's stick more precisely to the NATO summit and what was said and what came out of it. One of the things that struck me, and I think it was reflected by what you were saying, your takeaways from the NATO summit were that, military spending and NATO and America's role in NATO is now sorted out, as it were, now established. One of the things that struck me was the debate that started up when Trump took office in January 2005 was was he planning to pull out of NATO? Was he planning to pull NATO out of Europe, I should say? Was he planning to pull out of NATO, the United States out of NATO at all? And I think that was always a pretty silly debate, but it's settled now. Trump, exactly as you put it, Trump wants Europe to bear a bigger burden of the financial, military, and social costs of NATO's presence in Europe. But he also wants a rearmed Europe to remain under the United States control. There is, however, having said that, a great deal of potential for unanticipated consequences, don't you think? Particularly when you consider the direction Germany is now moving in under Friedrich Merz. The German Chancellor mentioned in the Munich Security Conference in February that he was talking to France. They were discussing a European wide nuclear force. There have been one or two mentions of that in other forums, for example. And since February, it's become even clearer that Germany is a serious driving force for European rearmament and planning to play a much stronger security role, as Merch sees it anyway. What do you think of that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. Um, I mean, just on the Germany thing, I I mean, and I think many others, particularly from the peace movement, have been so shocked by Germany's massive conversion to militarization. And in the post-Second World War world, Germany had, if not exactly become a force for peace, was sort of, relatively not pro-war, wasn't using its military beyond its own borders, and so on. It was a different kind of animal at that time. And of course, when the US tried to put Pershing missiles into Western Europe in the 1980s, massive movements across Germany, enormous mobilizations against that. So it's always had a kind of bit of a pro-peace reputation. And so with the onset of the Ukraine war, it's like that just changed overnight, and suddenly there's this kind of rampant militarization and, spent military spending thing and all that kind of thing. So, um, yeah, it's quite shocking. And also, it's very disturbing. I mean, you mentioned about the sort of German French kind of nuclear cooperation thing. I mean, President Macron was suggesting that French nuclear weapons, which they've got an arsenal a little bit bigger than Britain's, but not massive. But that should be a kind of European nuclear protection force. Well, that's one thing. But I think most disturbing is that there are prominent figures in Germany that are calling for Germany to develop its own nuclear weapons program. I mean, never mind the fact that there are US nukes there anyway under the auspices of NATO. The idea that there should be a German nuclear weapon. I mean, it just, you just wonder what's going on in people's heads, to be honest, So I think, yeah, this is very dangerous. It's such a positive thing that there are from the movement across Europe. There are strong initiatives, including from Germany here and other countries, to work together to try and prevent this kind of rearmament of Europe thing, including to prevent nuclear proliferation on the European continent.
Yes. One of the pleasures of discussing something like a NATO summit with a historian is that you take a longer view of things and you can remind people of past examples and past experiences. The so-called fact-checking media that we've got running rampant in Britain always fails to do this, always fails to note the lessons of the past because they're inconvenient to its political masters. And it's not just Germany, is it? I mean, I've been following Finland. It's not a country I claim to know a great deal about, but I'm very nervous about developments there, as I'm sure people know. You do know, Kate. Finland shares a long border with Russia. It's traditionally remained neutral for that reason. It became a full member of NATO in 2023. It had been a partner for peace for ages before that and had actually taken part in non-aggressive, in inverted commas, non-aggressive activities of NATO. But it became a full member in 2023, so did Sweden. And in Finland's case, it was on the understanding that its non-alignment policy, its long-term prohibition on nuclear weapons on its territory, would exempt it from having US nuclear weapons, NATO nuclear weapons on its soil. On the 1st of July, the Finnish parliament amended that law to align with NATO policy, which requires all members to allow nuclear weapons to be stationed on their territory if NATO requires it. Um, Sweden is moving in a similar direction, so is Lithuania. Um, what do you think of that? Do you think there's a possibility of seeing more nuclear weapons states or nuclear weapons um, hosting states in Europe in the near future? Do you think that's a realistic possibility?
I think it's a realistic possibility. I mean, just on Finland, I'm involved in the NATO network, which is an international network, and these are marvelous activists who you may know, Carol, from Finland. She's called Ulla, and she almost tearing her hair out about the way Finland has gone and so rapidly. And it's a bit like the speed with which Germany has kind of overturned, decades of kind of neutralish sort of, whatever position. But in Finland, it's very, very marked. And she said that the Russophobia is so extreme there now. And other activists, peace activists in Sweden are sort of devastated by the kind of the NATO thing, So it's very disturbing. I mean, in terms of, yes, maybe they will host nuclear weapons. That depends very much on whether the United States wants to put nuclear weapons there, because that's where they will have to come from, certainly in the short to medium term. No one's going to be developing their own weapons in the long term. Maybe they would buy US nukes, but that's the big question. So it does really come down to the US. And I suppose the question is, in terms of strategic placement of nuclear weapons, are those the best places to have them? Or as US nukes have now come back to Lakenheath in Britain, in East Anglia, you know, they've chosen to reposition them there and the other places across Western Europe. So are those better strategically for the US NATO interest? Maybe they would rather concentrate conventional forces in places like Finland and Lithuania. So it's very disturbing that they are willing to have them. Whether that will transpire, hard to say, but I think it's a very disturbing direction.
Yeah, quite so, quite so. Um, there were also other threats or comments, contradictory statements, what have you, other statements by Trump during the summit that sort of returned to the theme of America's and NATO's dominance of Europe. So he said, for instance, he re-raised the threat to invade Greenland, I recall, and he made a suggestion that Spanish trade links were going to suffer because Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, has refused permission for the US to use Spanish bases in the um, US and Israel war on Iran. All sorts of sort of what I would call bullying. The idea that you can control international developments, international relations, and even more so military conflicts and potential conflicts by issuing threats. It's absolutely crazy what happened to diplomacy.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm not surprised at Trump's threat again over Greenland. If he wants it, he wants it for resources, for strategic assets and so on, then he's going to pursue it, and he's going to face down Denmark. Well, actually, I don't think Denmark should be there either. I'm gr- Greenland for the Greenlanders, basically. But, obviously we don't want the United States going in there whatsoever. But I mean, he had a success in Venezuela, one of his few international successes. He managed to go in there, get his troops in there, get President Maduro and First Lady and so on. So that success presumably would have emboldened him. But now Iran isn't going his way at all, so maybe he'll hold back. So I think, yes, he's going to keep on saying that about Greenland, hoping that bullying will get it for him without any kind of, big expenditure on troops or something like that. But who knows whether, he's just going to pontificate about that. I mean, Spain, this is very interesting. He threatened Spain after the last NATO summit, because you may remember that Spain at that time refused, it was the only country in NATO that refused to commit to 5%. And Trump at the time, he was rather sanguine about it. He said, oh, well, we'll just get the money back through tariffs instead. So I'm not surprised about these threats now over the use of Spanish bases. What will actually come of it, who knows? Because Trump does terrible things, terrible situation in Iran, terrible support for genocide in Gaza, and all kinds of very bad things. But sometimes he threatens very bad things and doesn't do them, so there's the kind of windbaggery element too. But so let's see. Let's see what he does for both of those countries.
Absolutely. As you know, I'm a very keen, close watcher of the Middle East, and it's very tempting to respond to some of what you're saying by getting into a discussion about what's happening in the Middle East. But I'll resist it. I'll resist it for the moment. Let's have a look at Ukraine, which again played a prominent role in the NATO summits. Ukraine's had successes with drones and long range missile attacks into Russian territory. They've been very much highlighted by the European media and in Britain. But in contrast to that, the EU delegation to Ukraine pointed out in May that May was the deadliest month for civilians in Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion in 2022. And it seems to me that both countries in reality are beginning to suffer the impact of war. It's not surprising, of course. The costs of war, both human and economic, are really taking their toll on Russia as far as I can see. But the inability of Ukraine to continue the war without greater and greater injections of military support from NATO and Europe just goes unremarked.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly the case. I mean, it's also the case that the Russian economy hasn't suffered as intensely and immediately as was foretold. But nevertheless, of course, it is impacting on the country and its population. I suppose one of the things to just point out is that the injections of military support and financial support are basically coming from the European members of NATO. I'm not sure what the US is now giving. Pretty much, I don't want to say any figures because I don't have them to hand, but I think that that's slumped right down. So it is Europeans putting that money and that supporting and loans, of course, as well. I mean, how's Ukraine ever going to pay this stuff back? But anyway, I mean, I would just say that at the recent international anti-war conference in London, on 20th of June, there were speakers. We had young activist speakers from both Ukraine and from Russia. They came on together and they spoke together, about the devastation that is happening to the populations there and to the young people in particular who are kind of the fodder for going into the firing line. And I just really feel for the people on both sides. The death toll is unbelievable. I mean, it really is. It's hundreds of thousands. And how can anyone think that sending young people to fight and kill hundreds of thousands, how can they think that that's an okay way to solve disputes? And in fact, actually, I think this is something that is really talked about amongst young people today, because of all the questions and issues that are arising around conscription. It's not been mooted exactly in that form in Britain yet, but some tentative steps in that direction. But certainly, it is an issue in European states. And I was walking past King's Cross the other day, and there were two young blokes walking along, and one was said, "Well, I'm not going to go and fight and get killed in a ditch, against some other country. Why would I want to do that?" And I think that that is a very, very strong sentiment. And of course, I've heard it at other conferences and online, young people from both Russia and Ukraine, some of them deserters, talking about why they won't fight, and I completely support them. Of course, the right to conscientious objection, as you know, is enshrined in international law, and there's a long peace movement tradition and history of refusing to fight in war. And if you don't mind me just throwing in something about Pat Arrowsmith again, Carol, one of the things that I've been writing about her is how she often tried to persuade troops not to go and fight, whether it was in Vietnam in the 1960s or Northern Ireland in the 1970s. And she did have some success. There were people who decided that they wouldn't stay in the army, and people were given advice about what to do and so on. And she was actually sentenced to a very long spell in prison for incitement to disaffection, as it's called. So there is a strong tradition of that, and I think we need to be more aware of the troops, and the impact on them, as well as the terrible impact on the civilians. And we have to be clear, it's not in our name. Our government goes places and says, we've got to pour more money into this war and pour more weapons. But, most people just want that war to end and to stop the killing.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got my own tale about what young people think about the wars that are going on. You'll enjoy this. It was on a CND demonstration in Furford against the use of the base for the war on Iran. And Lindsay German and me was standing to one side, listening to the planes taking off on the runway, and sheltering from the sun. It was a very hot day. And three young lads, sort of 9, 10, 11, that sort of age range, on their bikes, stopped to have a look to see what was going on. One of them turned to one of the police sort of supervisors, protectors of the march, and said, "What's this? What's going on here?" and the policeman said, "Oh, it's a demonstration, it's a protest about the war in Iran. What do you think of that?" And the young lad said, "Oh, it's ridiculous. You shouldn't be involved in a war in Iran." And his two mates sort of nodded and agreed. And the funniest catchline was the policeman said, "Yep, you're right." I guess if his superiors ever hear of this podcast, he might be in a bit of trouble. But more seriously, I don't think that conscription is on the cards for Britain in the immediate term. But I think there are two things which are worrying. One is the increased presence of the military in universities and the fact that they have the money to influence the work and the academic programs that the universities put on. And I think that's of great concern. I think that's of immediate concern. I notice it's coming much more into the press. And I think the second thing, which is less prominent in the media, but I would have some concerns about, is the fact that one of the possible responses to the rise in unemployment of young people, the so-called NEETs, not in education, employment or training, young people who are economically inactive, apparently for no reason, um, this actually raises the prospects either of advertising join the army and learn a career, which is what the army propaganda was still about during the Iraq war in 1991. And I think we could come back to that sort of thing again. So it's a different agenda, but I do think that the issue of young people going into the military is gradually finding its way onto the sort of British agenda. You're more in touch than I am with the anti-war movement in Europe. What are some of the experiences in places like Germany and elsewhere about the rise of debate about prescription
Yeah, there's a
conscriptions.
Yeah, there's a developing movement there because in some countries, I'm not quite sure exactly where it's got to in Germany, but there is, conscription is being introduced or phased in. I mean, I know here it's to do with things like what happens to the reserve forces and that kind of thing. But also, I mean, just to say in terms of schools, there is definitely already um, a tendency towards recruitment and promotion of the military and so on as you know an adventure thing, but also as a training thing. So there's a lot of stuff around apprenticeships in the so-called defense industry and so on. So that's definitely taking place. And I just saw a new report today, I think it was, that I saw it anyway, that 35 universities are participating in a government initiative around kind of military development and technology. So they're really going great guns, if I could put it like that, on the kind of military in the education sector. So that's bad, obviously. But I think, yeah, in Europe, uh, I suppose the very positive thing is the development of movements and self-organization amongst young people against conscription. And I think we're going to see some element of that here as well, because of course it hasn't, as you rightly say, it hasn't been posed in that way yet. But you can see the kind of, around the edges that it's going to go in that direction, as well as you say, in schools and universities and trying to sort of pull people into the defense, so-called defense sector.
Yeah. We saw a bit of what you're talking about at the International Anti-War Conference that was hosted by Stop the War recently. Um, the all this talk takes me back to the issue that we began to talk about, that began to be raised about nuclear threats during a potential war. And I think the final question I'd like to pose is, let's take a step back from the immediate developments and consider the longer term, Kate. When it comes to NATO and European rearmament, I'm increasingly aware that everybody, politicians, military, security experts, commentators of all sorts, everybody takes the prospect of war, coming war, they take it for granted. They talk about rearmament as if war were inevitable. I've never heard any mainstream media presenter or pundit, never heard any of them ask the question, how can we stop the war? Um, a recent Financial Times editorial put the danger of nuclear war, because nuclear is posed, isn't it? The danger of nuclear war rather succinctly, I thought. And it, it ended with the statement that fundamental truth remains that the more weapons exist, the greater the risk of catastrophe. And what that took me back to was something that Jeffrey Sachs said um, in January 2026, when the UN Security Council had an emergency meeting at the time of the US invasion of Venezuela. He said, we've experienced two world wars in the 20th century, but there would be no third chance. We're now in the nuclear age. In a worldwide war, humanity would perish. What's your take on that? What do you think, Kate? Am I putting an exaggerated picture across?
Carol, I don't think you're exaggerating at all. I don't think that's an overdramatic way of putting it. In fact, I would say that it's pretty remarkable that we've avoided further nuclear use up until now. You know, we had nuclear weapons used twice against a non-nuclear state in 1945. So they haven't been used again. There have been tests in the atmosphere and so on, but in war, they haven't been used again. And it's not just luck or, whatever, that they haven't been. A huge amount of effort went into preventing them being used again. So, from pressure from the peace movements, mass mobilization against war, against the nuclear arms race. I'm thinking particularly in the 1980s against cruise and Pershing missiles. So, all that stuff. And then there's been very serious work from some politicians and diplomats, particularly internationally, who could see the dangers, who built treaties, they built mechanisms to reduce risk, reduce nuclear arsenals. So that's been a big thing in preventing that war, the nuclear war. And of course, we've got the overwhelming majority of states that have rejected nuclear weapons. So having nuclear weapons and risking nuclear war, it's let's call it a minority sport. There's how many countries are there in the world? Is it 190 odd, something like that? Only 9 have nuclear weapons. They are the ones that are putting the world on the edge of catastrophe. The overwhelming majority of states have rejected nuclear weapons, and over half the world is organized into nuclear weapons free zones. So let's remember that, that is really important. The problem today, or one of the problems today, is that much of the work, that fantastic work that was done over decades, much of that work has been undone. And a lot of it was undone in Trump's first presidency, and he's continued the undoing into his second presidency. So he's trashed nuclear arms control treaties, for example. I won't go into all of them now, but so we're entering into this new nuclear arms race period, and without doubt that is happening. And he's also the guy who said, well, Why can't we start testing nuclear weapons, again? Why can't we use nuclear weapons? This is a guy, who asks questions like that. And when the people who have their fingers on the nuclear buttons don't see why they shouldn't be used, we are in really big trouble. So, Carol, as you know, I'm going to say this, we need to really step up anti nuclear campaigning as well as anti war campaigning. And we need to stop the politicians that are driving us hell for leather towards destruction.
Absolutely. It's not an exaggeration to say you're in deep shit. I I think you can see from the figures in the ICANN report, which we've both mentioned throughout this podcast, you can see those from those figures that there's already a new nuclear arms race underway, and that it's driven by the United States primarily, the US and Britain. The US attempt to develop ballistic missile shields so it can use nuclear weapons in a quote unquote theatre situation, i.e., mini nukes, which are not mini at all, but smaller, less extensive nuclear weapons in a regional war. And by the fact that Britain is expanding its nuclear capability, we've not only got a nuclear armed navy, but very soon, because we're buying US nuclear jets and we've got US nuclear bombs stationed at Lakenheath, very soon we're going to have an air force that's equipped for nuclear weapons. And it is a very dangerous world. I would like to leave it on a happier note. I think at least we've discussed what is rational. Can think of one happier note, and that is that CND is campaigning for the restoration of the New START Treaty. And it might not be as glossy or as attractive as some of the on the streets protests, but I do hope lots more people will support that effort. Kate Hudson, it's been a really interesting discussion. It's lovely to speak to you at length again. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining Labour CND's podcast today.
Thank you very much.